I think what happens is that they've been told by HR experts and selection experts that they have to get this list of exclusive competencies, and then what they need to do is to find evidence of them. That's what they've been told, and it seems pretty natural. These are the things you want, and therefore you've got to look for evidence of them. The problem with that is really twofold. First of all, there's no list of the things you don't want. Now, in some organisations in the security business and the military, they have a list of things they definitely don't want, and they look for them. In business, they seem not to be interested in this. Surprisingly not, they only look for things they want, not for things they don't want. And the second problem is that they believe that the more they see of something they want is a good thing. So if you see someone who's very, very cooperative or very, very good with clients or very, very creative, that's a good thing, and the more is better. Now the problem with that is extremes of anything are usually very dangerous. So you have, if somebody's extremely creative, it's quite likely that he or she might have some problem. We might call it schizotypal behavior, or they might be very unreliable. So the idea is to have a modicum or a maximal amount of this, curvilinear, not linear. So the two things that people get wrong most of the time, in my experience, is they never think about what they don't want and why people with these characteristics might apply to them. And when they do look for the things they do want, they always assume that more is better. Whereas in my view, you want an optimal amount, not a maximum amount. I think it's an important question to know how much expertise you know in the area of what we might call the dark side of personality. I think people are becoming more and more aware of the select-out criteria. I think it's important that people, if they use one of these measures, one of the most well-known is the Hogan Development Survey, which is a measure of the subclinical personality disorders, I think that they will, before they use it, they'd have to go on some sort of course, definitely. So I think, obviously, when you're having people who are making selection decisions and doing interviews, they need to have the expertise to know what they're looking for, whether it's a select out or a select in, what the manifestations are, and how to get at that information. So I think it is important that people are trained in what I might call the select out or the dark side of behaviour in the workplace. A nudge theory comes from, if it is such a theory, comes from behavioural economics. And the behavioural economists have suggested that the way in which you present people with certain information helps them make a decision in a particular way. Now, there's a man called Cialdini who's done a lot of work on persuasion. And he said there are various techniques that you can use to persuade people, very powerful techniques. He recommends there's 6 of these techniques. For instance, the very famous one is reciprocity. I give in order to receive. So I give you a little present, give you something, and you give it back to me. Now, that's not entirely nudge theory, but the nudge theory suggests that if you're in the business of persuasion, usually you present people with information. If you want to persuade them to buy one product and not another, you give them certain amounts of information. And the way in which you give that information helps to persuade them. Let me give you one example, and that is the psychology of gain versus the psychology of loss. So if you said to somebody, if they do something, let me give you a classic example from a well-known study. It was an Israeli bank, and what they were trying to do was to get their customers to use their credit cards more. So you make money if they use their credit cards, so how do you persuade the customer to use their credit card? Well, some people say, well, tell them that they get air miles. So the more you use your credit card, the more air miles you get. Others said, well, tell them that people will be impressed, that when you get out your credit card, then people will be in admiration of you, and therefore you'll use their card more. So this is all the psychology of gain. You'll gain air points, you'll gain admiration. And other people say, no, that won't work. Just send them a letter saying if they don't use their credit card in 6 months, they'll take it away. And that one worked most of all, because it was the psychology of loss. So if you present people with gains or losses, most people think, people will be motivated by the promise of gain. In fact, nudge theory suggests more likely that the promise of loss or the threat of loss is more motivational. So in the context of an organisation, within an organisation, if you are in a department trying to persuade people to do things, you would do well to look at nudge theory, to look at the various strategies you could use to persuade people in the organisation to do specific things you want them to do. I think the potential for loss isn't always negative. I have to say it doesn't always work. I mean, one of the great examples of this, I think, was the Brexit issue. And what we had there was the Remainers only did psychology of loss. They told us again and again the world would collapse, it would all get terrible, and no one gave us any good reason to stay in. So in that sense, it's what you say, it's the idea that loss is negative. But I think that if you say to people that there is a potential gain and loss in all decisions, but if you emphasize the loss slightly more than the gain, that you give people a balance, that will tip them over into being persuaded to move in that direction. It's another great myth, money and motivation, and I've looked into this for many years. I think there are a number of explanations. The first, I want to make a distinction between what is called intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation, you do something, whatever it is, you do your work, you do your hobby, for the pure joy of it. You don't need anything else than the activity itself. So it's intrinsically motivating. And some jobs are intrinsically motivating. Potters and painters are intrinsically motivated. Extrinsic is where it's not particularly enjoyable and that you need to give people some incentive. And it might be money, it might be a pension, it might be something else. Now, the question has been for many, many years, surely money is a good motivator, that you do this and you get that. Well, the psychologists say, no, that's not true, and there's lots of evidence for this. Essentially, that if people are paid market forces, or slightly above market forces, in other words, that you're getting paid for the job around you, people in that job get roughly that amount. And in your workplace, you're paid equitably, in other words, your seniority and your expertise is recognized, then money will give you no motivation whatsoever. And there are four reasons. Number one, the problem is that people adapt to it very quickly. So if you got a raise today, a 20% raise, you'd be very happy. The question is, how long would the effect last? 3 months? 4 months? And if in 4 months' time the effect's gone away and your motivation's gone back, I'm going to have to give you another 20% raise and another 20% raise. People adapt very quickly. Secondly, the most important predictor of a person's satisfaction with their money is not how much they get, but how much they get relative to other people. Now, I don't compare myself with you, you don't compare yourself with me, but you can make people very angry, indeed, by having an unfair comparison. The third factor is the alternatives. One game I always play when I go into a big room of business people, I say, now, I'm going to make you an offer. I'm going to make you an offer, say, £5,000 or a week's extra holiday. What do you want? And if they say £5,000, I say 2 weeks. If they say a week, I say £6,000. Now, many of the people I deal with, you'll say £8,000 and they'll say, no, a week, £10,000 a week. In other words, money is not as important as time or jobs or the ability to work from home. And the fourth factor is worry about keeping that money from the taxman and various other people. So what the psychologists say is, yes, you've got to pay people equitably and you've got to pay people market forces. And you've got to manage them well. Do not believe that money in and of itself will be a motivator. I've often said, if a man comes to you, the supervisor comes to you and says, if you pay people peanuts, you get monkeys. I can't motivate people with the money I pay them. I say, sack this individual. They have no idea about management. We have the private sector, the public sector, and the voluntary sector. Now, how do you manage people in the voluntary sector? They're not getting any money, but you've got to manage them. Pay people equitably, pay people market forces, and manage them well. And you don't need vast sums of money, which will not have the effect you think it will have.